For a country that forms the intersection of two major oceans, the Atlantic and Indian, South Africa has a relatively limited and recent history of naval warfare and development. Although some scholars, like Sanusi Credo-Mutwa, maintain that Phoenician sailors reached South Africa where they exploited the natives in search of gold and ivory, the historical evidence of these claims is slim. The native people of South Africa, whether the hunter-gatherer San Bushmen or the later cattle-owning Khoi and Bantu tribes, were focused on the land and its bountiful resources. The ocean and the world beyond remained an unknown mystery. Arab traders may have traded down Africa's east coast, but it is only in the 15th century of the Common Era that we see the first concrete evidence of naval activity off the coast of southern Africa. The turning point in world history in terms of trade and exploration was the reign and conquest of Genghis Khan and his descendants. The enormous Mongol Empire brought East and West into contact for the first time. Along the thousands of miles of the Silk Road, trade, technology and ideas flowed from Europe to far eastern Asia and back, protected by the horsemen of the great Khans. Most important of the new technology introduced to Europe in this time was the magnetic compass and gunpowder. For a century, from the 1220s to the 1340s, Eastern spices, textiles and technologies were all the rage in Europe. It was this explosion of trade that ultimately doomed the spice road, as the Black Death spread from Asia to Europe alongside the imported goods from the East. By the time the plague had subsided, half of Europe's population was dead, with cities being especially hard hit. Added to this, the Ottoman Turks stepped into the vacuum left by the dying Mongol Empire to establish control over much of Central Asia and the Old Spice Road. The Ottomans were not friendly to European or Eastern traders, and contact between Europe, India and the Far East was lost for a time. With the land route cut, thoughts turned towards finding a naval route between East and West. And it was the East who got started first. The Black Death destroyed the old Mongol Empire, and native Chinese were once again in control of the world's most populous and advanced nation. This new dynasty, calling themselves Ming, were determined to restore China's greatness and preeminence in trade. The Yongle Emperor commanded that a fleet of treasure ships explore the lands and oceans surrounding China. Whilst most of these expeditions visited countries closer to home, some travelled as far as Africa. South Africa was never their destination, however, and the Chinese treasure ships soon passed into history when the next emperor took over. It was the Europeans who were the most successful in exploiting the naval routes between East and West. In the late 15th century, with the trickle of Eastern goods fetching enormous profits to the traders who could get them in, Portugal and Spain were both now in a position to explore the Atlantic Ocean and find a way to reopen trade routes between Europe and Asia. In 1487, a small fleet left Lisbon harbour, commanded by Bartholomew Dias. Previous explorers had attempted to reach the southern tip of Africa and failed, and Dias was determined to demonstrate that the most effective way of reaching India and Asia lay in ships sailing down the west coast of Africa. Having landed in Namibia and sailed around Africa's southern tip, Dias had realized his mission, and with his crew on the verge of mutiny, he returned back to Portugal. In 1497, Vasco da Gama successfully completed the sea journey from Portugal to India, becoming the first European to reach India by sea. His voyage is considered a milestone in world history, as it marked the beginning of the age of globalization and colonialism. The main spices obtained in India were pepper and cinnamon, over which the Portuguese maintained a commercial monopoly for several decades. The Portuguese avoided the Cape of Storms, as they named it, and preferred to establish bases in East and West Africa, in modern-day Angola and Mozambique. Sailing between these points, they never established a foothold in South Africa. Their most important contribution was the naming of Natal, which means Christmas in Portuguese. In 1645, Jan van Riebeeck, the former head of the Dutch East Indies or WWII's Tonkin trading post, began to advocate for a WWII refreshment station to be built on the Cape of Good Hope, after having stayed there briefly on a previous voyage. His proposal was taken up, and he was given command of the expedition, arriving in two ships, the Dromedarius and the Goeiehoop, on the 6th of April 1652. From that time onwards, streams of Dutch settlers arrived at the Cape, followed by French Huguenots, until a full-blown Dutch Cape colony was established and ruled from Holland, with an appointed South African governor. This colony lasted from 1652 to 1795. The French Revolution would have a dramatic influence on the history of the Cape and the naval history of South Africa. In 1795, the armies of revolutionary France invaded and occupied the Netherlands. In response, Great Britain, which was at war with France, launched operations against the Dutch Empire to prevent their use by the French Navy. This included the Dutch colony at Cape Town. The Dutch South African garrison was centered on the castle of Good Hope. This conflict would give rise to the only two naval amphibious battles ever waged off the South African coast. Battle of Muizenberg, 1795. A short, sharp engagement between the Royal Navy and the Dutch colonial government was fought off the coast of Muizenberg, which resulted in a British victory and the capture of Dutch shipping. Following the Peace of Amiens in 1802, the Cape was returned to the Netherlands, only for the British to invade again in 1806. This resulted in the far bloodier Battle of Blouberg in January 1806, which resulted in the British establishing a lasting rule over the Cape. From now until 1913, a Royal Navy squadron would rule the South African seas, with very little involvement from the South Africans themselves. For more than a century, the Royal Navy defended the Cape Sea Route and the adjacent areas from its naval base at Simonstown. In 1900, at the height of the Boer War, construction began on a new harbour and breakwater, converting Simonstown into an important bastion of Royal Navy power. By 1910, the Cape of Good Hope had become one of Admiral Fisher's 5 strategic keys that locked up the globe for the British Empire. The Cape was positioned at a natural choke point in the shipping lanes of 2 of the Earth's major oceans. On the 1st of July 1913, the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve South Africa came into being. The forerunner of the modern Navy, the RNVR-SA expanded considerably upon the outbreak of World War I, with the Union government increasing its General Service section to 7 companies and forming a minesweeping section consisting of 3 flotillas for equipping and manning minesweeping trawlers for local defence in the time of war. The vital role of sweeping for naval mines around the Cape of Good Hope would be revealed only too soon. In November 1916, just as the bloody Battle of the Somme was being concluded, German auxiliary cruiser SS Wolf sailed from Germany to disrupt and sink Allied shipping. Converted from a cargo vessel, the Wolf was armed with 7 150mm guns, 4 torpedo tubes, and 400 deadly naval mines. On the night of the 16th and 17th of January, the Wolf laid its first minefield off Disson Island, South Africa, followed by another minefield the next night off Cape Agulhas. These mines would sink any ship unfortunate enough to strike them, and the potential for closing off the Cape Sea route was a very ominous development for the Allies. In 15 months at sea, the SS Wolf captured 14 Allied vessels with her gunfire and sank another 13 ships with her minefields. This incident highlighted to the Union government that whilst they may be able to rely on the Royal Navy for defence against large fleets, an asymmetrical threat like naval mines required the South Africans to secure their own waters. As a result, an agreement was reached at the 1921 Imperial Conference, where the British Admiralty agreed to make available to the Union, as a gift, 2 minesweeping trawlers, the Aden and the Foyle, and the new twin mine-screw minesweeper, the Crozier. These 3 small vessels sailed from England and arrived in Simonstown Harbour on the evening of the 17th of January 1922. The first 3 ships of the Empire's youngest navy, the South African Navy, was born. It was destined, however, to be something of a stillborn birth. With the primarily Afrikaans leadership of the UDF having little regard for naval matters, the 3 minesweepers limped on until the Great Depression, at which time, due to budgetary constraints, the South African naval forces were all but disbanded. By 1934, the South African ships were laid up and their crews discharged. This ended the Union's attempt to maintain a small local naval service, all defence at sea reverting directly back to the Royal Navy. Rebirth of a Navy, the Small Ship War. When the Second World War broke out in September 1939, the South African naval forces consisted of only 2 officers and 3 ratings. South Africans eager for naval service still signed up with the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve South Africa, but these men were posted directly to British warships across the globe. From cruisers to battleships, aircraft carriers and frigates, men from South Africa served aboard the Royal Navy vessels in all theatres of the war. In fact, one of the first things the Royal Navy did upon entering the war was to call up all the various reserve squadrons for immediate service. This did nothing to improve the pitiful state of South Africa's own naval defences, which were non-existent. Once again, the indirect threat of mines, sabotage groups and U-boats would have to be dealt with by the South Africans themselves, whilst the Royal Navy focused on the surface fleet and meeting its monumental commitments to its enormous but fragile empire. Accordingly, one of the first acts implemented by the Union Defence Force upon the outbreak of war was to requisition local trawlers and whale catchers to be converted into auxiliary warships. These vessels were taken in hand and converted into minesweepers and anti-submarine vessels. To command this new seaward defence force, Prime Minister Smuts appointed Rear Admiral J.W. Halifax. A retired officer of the Royal Navy, Halifax had served throughout the First World War and was present at the Battle of Jutland. Appointed as Secretary to the Governor-General of the Union of South Africa, he had settled down in Cape Town in 1937. This new seaward defence force soon grew to 526 men aboard 18 vessels, 13 minesweepers and 5 anti-submarine vessels. The first sweeps of Cape Town's harbour had already commenced by mid-September 1939. How minesweeping works. The most common mine laid in the early war was the moored contact mine, a large explosive charge moored to the sea floor by an anchor. The mine was positioned beneath the surface some 10 to 20 feet. Several protruding horns stick out from the shell, and when they make contact with the passing ship, they explode, ripping a huge hole in the hull. In clearing such a minefield, each mine's mooring cable is cut by an armed sweep wires towed from the minesweeper's stern. During sweeping operations, the otters and floats control the sweep wire with the cutting gear attached. The float may submerge when the sweep cable takes the strain of a mine. Once the cable is cut, the mine will float to the surface, where it is holed with gunfire, then explodes or sinks to the bottom. The larger and faster vessels were fitted out in Simonstown with ASDEC sonar equipment, and the first 2 anti-submarine trawlers, Mooivlei and Blomvlei, were ready in April 1940. A month later, the naval war off South Africa began on the 13th and 14th of May, when 2 explosions were seen at night, 10 nautical miles from the Cape Agulhas lighthouse. Admiral Halifax ordered 4 of the 6 available minesweepers to investigate the area. On the evening of the 15th of May, the flotilla made their first contact with enemy mines, with a number exploding during the sweep. The flotilla eventually accounted for 11 mines. These had been laid by the German raider Atlantis on the night of the 11th of May. In November 1940, the South African government received a request from the Admiralty for anti-submarine and mine vessels to be sent to the Mediterranean. Admiral Halifax felt that the existing vessels sweeping South African waters were too small, so he earmarked slightly larger whaling vessels, then undergoing conversion, to form the South African flotilla. Known as the 22nd Anti-Submarine Group of the British Mediterranean Fleet, these 4 small vessels had an exciting war ahead of them. They were the HMSAS Southern Isles, the HMSAS Southern Sea, the HMSAS Southern Maid, and the HMSAS Southern Flow. Aboard the Southern Isles was a young stoker by the name of Rene Sethren. Educated at Springs English Medium School, the young Chief Petty Officer was a keen boxer and sportsman, highly disciplined, intelligent, and dedicated to the Navy. Sethren and the rest of the 22nd Anti-Submarine Group sailed from Durban on the 15th of December 1940 under the command of Lieutenant Commander A.F. True. The passage to Alexandria through Mombasa and Aden was spent fruitfully training the young crews for the battles ahead. Known as the Southerns from the names of their ships and their South African origin, the 22nd Anti-Submarine Group was soon in the thick of the fighting in the Mediterranean theatre. Arriving at Alexandria on the 11th of January 1941, the Southerns were tasked with guarding the supply route to Libya. Since the Italians already had many submarines in that area, there would surely be plenty for them to do. It was not just the Italians they would be facing. Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, had just begun his first offensive, and the supply route for the British 8th Army in Libya was more strained than ever. Leading his flotilla into the newly captured harbour of Tobruk, Commander True and his men were the first South Africans to see the harbour town that would feature so heavily in the fortunes of the South African war effort. 3 days after arriving at Tobruk, the flotilla was attacked in the evening by 3 Ju-88s. Luckily the bombs missed, but it was a stark indication as to just how dangerous the Tobruk route was to become. It was soon given the nickname of Bomb Alley. Just how dangerous this area was became apparent to the South Africans on the morning of the 11th of February, when the Southern Sea arrived off the patrol route near Tobruk, but her sister ship, the Southern Flow, was nowhere to be seen. Striking a mine at just after 4 a.m., the Southern Flow swiftly sank. 9 men managed to clear the wreckage and began swimming for safety, hoping for rescue. During the dark, the men drifted apart, and only one survivor, stoker C.J. Jones, was picked up by an Australian destroyer. The rest of the crew were never found. The remaining 3 South African ships of the 22nd Anti-Submarine Group continued to patrol the dangerous waters of Bomb Alley. As Rommel tightened his grip on Libya, he encircled the port of Tobruk and began to besiege the defenders inside, their only lifeline being the supply route by sea, something Rommel was determined to strangle. On the 29th of June 1941, the HMSAS Southern Isles sailed from Mersa Matruh for Tobruk, accompanying the HMS Flamingo, an anti-aircraft sloop, and 2 vital supply ships. Arriving in the area on June the 30th, the convoy was soon attacked by 8 Stukas at around 2 p.m. From then on, they were under almost constant air attack. At 16:30, between 40 and 50 planes launched a determined assault. With bombs exploding all around, the bridge of the Southern Isles soon had been set on fire, when Sethren rushed up to replace 2 wounded men on the twin Lewis machine guns. Firing furiously, Sethren and the other anti-aircraft gunners tried desperately to drive off the aircraft, who were circling their prey like sharks in the water. With bullets flying everywhere, Sethren went down in a welter of blood. But soon he got up again to help shoot down a Ju-88 that was strafing the ship. When the attack was finally over, Sethren was carried down below with 11 bullet holes and 27 other battle wounds in his body. Sure that he was going to die, the crew said goodbye to Sethren when he was transferred to a hospital ship. Though he would never recover fully and his days as an athlete were behind him, Rene Sethren did survive. For his courage during the relentless air attacks, Rene Sethren was awarded the Conspicuous Gallantry Medal, the only South African ever to receive this coveted decoration. The remaining ships and crew of the 22nd Anti-Submarine Group continued to patrol Bomb Alley and the Mediterranean. They were joined in August 1941 by a replacement ship sent north to make up for the loss of the Southern Flow. The SAS Protea took up her place with the rest of the 22nd and began her patrols within weeks of arriving in the theatre. So successful were the Southerns that the Commander-in-Chief of the Mediterranean requested that these fine ships and their outstandingly efficient companies be retained in the Mediterranean beyond the original 6 months agreed to by the Union government. They would stay up north for the rest of the war. During that time, they were joined by a steady stream of South African minesweepers. On the 11th of July 1942, the SAS Protea spotted and sank the Italian submarine Ondina, whilst on patrol with the Southern Maid. The Ondina had surfaced to attack the Southern Maid, unaware that the Protea was nearby. It was a costly mistake, whereby the Protea forced the submarine to surface with depth charges and then sank her with gunfire. Most of the submarine's crew were picked up by the South African ships and transferred into captivity. It was not just the anti-submarine vessels that saw action in the Mediterranean. The minesweepers were in the thick of the action as well. The South African ships Beaver and Parktown were some of the last vessels to leave Tobruk when the harbour town finally fell to the Germans in 1942. Whilst evacuating personnel, the Beaver was hit by a Panzer shell from the Afrika Korps who had just entered the town. She managed to leave under heavy gunfire behind a smokescreen. Whilst the Beaver made good her escape, the Parktown was attacked and sunk by German E-boats. The high-speed German boats were ruthless, even trying to machine gun the surviving sailors bobbing in the water, only to be driven off by a German fighter aircraft who viewed such actions as unsporting. By mid-1944, the sweepers were redeployed to Greek waters to clear the numerous minefields in the Gulf of Athens. On the 30th of November 1944, Beaver hit a mine and sank. 7 of her 23-man crew survived. And again on the 12th of January 1945, the minesweeper Trian hit a mine and sank, leaving only one survivor, stoker J.J. Bosch. The last of the minesweepers only returned to Durban in December 1945. After the war and the separation between South Africa and the British Commonwealth, the government did, for a short while, try to maintain a blue ocean fleet that could fight large battles far from home. But due to sanctions over apartheid, they were forced to once again become a small ship navy dedicated to coastal defence. The cornerstone of this policy was a fleet of hard-hitting coastal strike craft. And in 1997, following democracy, one of these strike craft, the SAS Oswald Pirro, was renamed the SAS Rene Sethren in honour of a brave man and his comrades in the small ship navy who fought like mighty lions.